let's give it a shot. All right. This is a letter that I wrote to my mother. And I sent it to her like 3 weeks ago, and I never got a response. But here goes. Damius sent 5 subs for it. Dear Mom, I've been driving myself crazy ever since you stopped talking to me, wondering if I did something wrong, wondering if I was the reason that you had rejected me as your child, if I had been too mean, too harsh, too cruel to you. People said in my live chat that the fact that my mother didn't speak to me anymore was all they needed to know about me. The implication obviously being that any daughter who was rejected so wholeheartedly by her own mother must be a terrible person. And your silence hurt me, I'll be honest, but what I didn't realize was that your silence was a manipulation tactic, a way to make me question myself. Because when we were interacting, I was angry at you. I would ask you questions that you didn't answer. I would confront you with the continuous abuse I had experienced from you for the past 21 years of my life. I would ask you why, and you rarely answered. You didn't like me asking questions. You didn't like being held accountable. So the best option for you was to go dark so that I couldn't ask you those questions anymore. But the questions were still there, so where did they go? Towards me. I started interrogating myself on a daily basis, craving some resolution of our broken relationship. Asking myself the same questions I had asked you because I no longer had access. But now I've realized that I don't need to ask myself these questions. I also don't need to ask you these questions. I don't need your answers personally. I don't need your private, confused, awkward, evasive responses anymore. You never helped me process any of it anyways. But what I do want is justice. And there is a forum for me to get justice against you. You have smeared me and my dad's name in court over and over and over again, accusing us of the grossest things possible, which obviously adds insult to injury. But I won't be smearing your name, I will simply be telling the truth. I was confused by the idea of Christian charity, of giving you the benefit of the doubt. I made the mistake of letting you walk all over me, using me while you had power, and then slamming the door in my face when you no longer had a use for me. I don't want answers from you personally anymore. I want answers from you in front of a judge, in front of your lawyer, in front of my dad, in front of the world. The following is my recounting of the abuse I suffered at your hands throughout my life. It includes physical, sexual, educational, and emotional violations. I know you almost certainly won't respond to me. You haven't for many, many months, but I still want you to read this. I want you to know that I know what you did to me. I remember all of it, and I'm going to try to bring you to justice despite your best attempts to make me question myself and stop trying. Physical. Describing your physical abuse is somewhat tricky for me. You were sporadically violent, but I still feel that I and my siblings were physically violated and neglected in other ways over the course of our entire childhoods. To speak to the explicit violence, which was rare but still happened, there were several incidents. When I was about 11 years old, when we were living on the 3rd floor of Abyssinia Restaurant, I was in charge of my 4 younger siblings for many, many hours at a time, every day. Late one night, as you and Dad were closing up the restaurant, I was watching a movie with the kids, with my little sister Maggie in my lap. She was maybe a year old at the time. I don't remember exactly, but she was a baby. Due to my exhaustion from watching the kids all day, I fell asleep during the movie, and Maggie inadvertently fell out of my lap and onto the floor, bumping her head. After she fell, I woke up to her crying and was immediately filled with dread. I felt unfathomably guilty and terrified of what you would say. I rushed downstairs into the empty dining room with the kids to show Maggie to you to make sure she was okay, and tearfully told you what had happened, hoping you would understand. Instead of being sympathetic, you grabbed Maggie and screamed at me, telling me that I could have killed her and that I should be ashamed of myself for being so selfish. I don't remember exactly what you did with Maggie, but during your outburst, you also hit me several times, hard. They weren't calculated hits, they were sort of all over the place, but one grazed my face and the others were on my arms. I was so deeply ashamed at the thought that I could have killed my little sister that I was grateful for the beating, hoping that it would get rid of the pit of guilt in my stomach that I knew would plague me for weeks and would contribute to my growing OCD. In retrospect, the beating was the easy part. It was the anger in your eyes and the harsh, loud screams of condemnation that hurt the most. That was the worst physical violence that ever happened to me from you. Of course, there were still the occasional spankings with a wooden spoon, but I don't really have a problem with those. And I don't think you ever hit me again once I hit puberty. The most extreme violence I remember was not against me, but against my brother John, since I was rarely problematic in a way that, in your mind, required violence. He was. When Dad would go off to work in our early childhood, I distinctly remember how much he would hurt John, especially during homeschooling, for the brief period of time that you did homeschool us. You would sit at the granite countertop in our kitchen with him on those tall wooden chairs we had and go over math worksheets with him, while I worked on mine quietly in the armchair in the living room. When he would get stubborn, or not finish his sheet, or talk back to you, you would respond by taking a fistful of his hair, yanking his head up, and then slamming his face into the countertop and grinding it into the granite. I knew it was too much. Although John could be stubborn and annoying, he didn't deserve that, and it didn't stop there. You seemed to feel more free to be violent with him, maybe because he was a boy. One time he was messing around in the kitchen while you were cooking dinner, pasta with sauce, or something like that. Dad again wasn't there. He accidentally hit a potted plant you had on the countertop, and it fell to the floor and smashed into pieces. Again, you took a fistful of his hair and dragged him around the kitchen by his head, screaming at him for what he had done. Your screams were very angry and scary. Eventually, you let go of his hair and made him sweep it up. Again, those are only 3 distinct recollections I have of you being overtly physically violent. Your worst offense against us as your children was arguably the physical neglect. Our home at 1 Solar Street was periodically infested by bedbugs, fleas, mice, and rats. To the point... Hello.
Hi, Grace.
I'm reading my letter.
Oh.
Are you gonna be?
Are you done with it?
No.
Go ahead.
Okay. To the point where I would go into the kitchen for a late night snack in my early teenage years and have rats jumping out of the pantry at me when I opened the door. The pantry door. Dad tried to fix this problem many times with various solutions like diatomaceous earth, encouraging us all to wash our bedding, closing up the holes in the kitchen, cleaning out underneath the backyard deck, setting endless amounts of glue and spring traps for both the rats and the mice, and even drowning several rats. But the problem remained persistently for many years in my life, and it can't all be blamed on the fact that we were at the restaurant for those years between 2011 and 2015. This was a problem I experienced in our home from as early as I can remember. The basic issue came down to you refusing to keep a clean kitchen, and on a larger scale, a clean home. It was bad. I mean, worse than the average person could ever dream of. The mold was everywhere. The kitchen sink would fill with dishes that would sit there for days, weeks, sometimes even months, despite a dishwasher sitting right next to it. There would be entire colonies growing in the bottom of the sink where the sludge and dirty water would build up. The food in the fridge was almost always rancid or molding. The floor would constantly be coated in crumbs, sugar, sludge, and dropped food. The stovetop got so encrusted with filth that you literally gave up on ever cleaning it, which also, now that I think about it, was an obvious fire hazard, and actually several times, the dried food on the stovetop would catch on fire while you were cooking. It was like a hoarder house. There were paths through the garbage and clutter in the living room that we made for ourselves. The bug infestations were a different kind of hell. I distinctly remember being in 8th grade and waking up in the middle of the night for many months due to itching myself from flea bites. I was sleeping in the old playroom at the time, which was next to the downstairs bathroom, and I would drag myself over to the shower, turn the faucet to the hottest temperature, and while I was half asleep, would sway and let the scalding water beat down on my body with a bunch of bites on it for some relief so that I could get back to sleep for school the next day. This continued for months at a time. I don't know why you refused to clean. I know for a fact that you didn't have any system for me and my siblings to help you clean. I even tried instating a chore system with rewards several times to encourage everyone to clean up. It failed every time because you wouldn't stick to the reward system that I had set up as an attempt to help you. I also know for a fact that I spent years of my life attempting to combat the filth. From the ages of 6 to 10, I would intermittently embark on cleaning projects every month or so, attempting to tackle the kitchen or the living room or the playroom or the bathroom. I would get excited, devoting hours to dishes and scrubbing and organizing. I would work on it for days, immensely pleased at my progress, and because I was a hard worker, and I loved seeing the filth go away. I hated the filth with all of my heart, and I still do. It was so depressing and gross. Finally, I would have cleaned out the pantry or done all the dishes in the sink or scrubbed all the stains off the floor, and I would rush to get you and show you. Mom, we can keep it this way. Doesn't it look great? You would half-heartedly smile, give me a weak, thanks, sure, and it would return to its filth-encrusted state within a week. Eventually, I gave up. Many years later, after the restaurant, when I was maybe 15 or 16 years old, I had to grab something from our house while I was on my way into the city with my friends Edith and Hazelyn. Not wanting to seem weird, like I was hiding something, I brought them into our house through the living room and upstairs into my bedroom at the time, apologizing profusely for the mess. It was as bad as ever, and guiding them down the paths through the piles of trash and clothing was obviously embarrassing. They were polite, saying it was no big deal. But a few weeks later, at a sleepover, Edith looked at me sympathetically and said, "Grace, this is no offense to you, but I just wanted to say that your house is one of the craziest things I've ever seen." I wasn't stupid. I had seen my other friends' houses, and I knew that not everyone lived like me. I also knew that it couldn't all be blamed on the fact that we had a bigger family than other people, or the fact that we were homeschooled. But something about her saying that to me from a genuine place with no intention to personally humiliate me, but just to confirm to me that normal people thought what I was living in was crazy, stuck with me. Yes, Mom, normal people think this is fucking crazy. And it was so fucking crazy. I moved out to one of the apartments in the Wendell Street building that Dad was renovating fairly soon after that. And my interaction with you significantly decreased. This was also when your 5-year mental breakdown started, so the neglect wasn't even surprising anymore, it was just a matter of fact. There were a few more weird incidents that seemed more due to a mental decline than your previous actions. When I was 18, you made me beat you with a belt in the basement of Greenwich Ave so that you could be fixed in front of my brother John while my siblings upstairs could hear your screams of pain. That was unsettling, to say the least. Of course, you didn't force me overtly, as I was an adult at that time and didn't have to listen to you. The worst part about that was that I was angry at you, and so I did hit you hard with the belt, which you wanted, but it was just disturbing. The whole thing was disturbing. You should have never asked that of me. There was also the time that Tommy ran out of the house, still at Greenwich Ave, into the backyard because he was upset about something, and you ran down the hill after him and tackled him at the bottom near the dock, causing a scene and forcing the rest of us, including Dad, to rush after you and beg you to stop because we didn't want the neighbors to call the police. During your second or third time abandoning us, you briefly returned to the house in the car that you had claimed you were living in at the time to take Maggie and Joey out to dinner since you hadn't seen them for a while. Maggie was angry with you and started arguing outside with you while you were in the car at the front curb before she got in. And eventually you decided to give up on the conversation and drove off with her hands still on the handle of the open car door. A police report was made of this incident, and Maggie was 13. The last bizarre incident I can remember is when you decided to sit on the hood of John's car to prevent him from leaving the parking lot of, the address, which resulted in him driving around the lot with you on the hood, causing an obviously dangerous situation, which once again forced me and my dad to beg you to stop so that nobody got hurt and neighbors didn't call the police. The sexual abuse I experienced from you is the weirdest and most difficult for me to understand, especially considering that the past several years of my life have involved you attempting to gaslight me into thinking that my dad sexually abused me, which I have flatly denied over and over again. To be quite honest, I had repressed all of this to the point where it didn't even register with me that what you were doing with that whole operation was a combination of projection and deflection. When you accused my dad of currently sexually abusing me 2 years after me and you had seen each other in person in your last RO affidavit, that's when I knew that you were doing this to hurt him and or me, not because you thought it was true or because you cared about me. Because even if that was true, you would have no way of knowing it at that point. It was pure speculation that you wrote down as fact, and finally broke my last bit of trust in you. It began again in childhood. I was a very sexual child. Not sure if that's the right way to describe it, but I was certainly precocious. I learned how to masturbate very early, maybe around 3 years old, and kept it to myself for a few years because I simply didn't know what it was and had no idea it was wrong or inappropriate. But eventually I started to feel curiosity about what I was doing, and so I walked into your bedroom and asked you and Dad what people do when they touch their poochies and it feels good down there. It was a sort of covert confession. It felt private, but not wrong. Yet. Dad didn't understand that I was asking the question because I myself was doing this activity and laughed it off, attributing it to childish curiosity. You were more stern, but still relatively relaxed, and even told me that this is something for adults to do. Still, having no idea what masturbation or sex even was, I continued to do it simply for the fact that it felt good and helped me to go to sleep. This is when things got weird. It started with a very distinct memory I have of you and I being in the back area of the kitchen near the 3 window panes that looked out into the backyard. The other kids were playing in the living room. I was maybe 6 years old and we had all just woken up from a nap. You looked at me suspiciously and asked me if I had done that thing, in response to which I felt the throbbing of a pit of guilt and fear in my stomach. Out of shame, I said no, which I remember being a lie. I think I had masturbated, but since you suddenly seemed to think it was dirty and something to interrogate me about, I didn't want to admit to my newly shameful behavior. You seemed to suspect that I was lying and asked me to show my fingers to you. Despite my apprehension, I lifted my hand up and you leaned down and sniffed my fingers. My interpretation of this entire event at the time was that you had smelled my fingers to see if they had the smell of my own vagina on them to check whether I was lying or not. In retrospect, that doesn't really make any sense since little girls' genitals don't really have that scent. Many years later, during one of my final conversations in person with you about this issue at India Point Park, you admitted that you had smelled my fingers, but that it was not as often as I had described during my live streams, seemingly irritated that I had overstated the case to my audience, while not responding to the actual fact that you had put me through a sexual humiliation ritual. Eventually these tests stopped, not sure why. They didn't go on for that long either, maybe from the time I was 6 years old to 9 years old. Recently I've been told by my dad that you never made him aware of these little experiments you were enacting on me. I believe him. He was horrified the first time I told him about it. As I said before, he didn't even realize that my covert confession earlier was an actual confession. He didn't really have any discussions with me about masturbation, except once when I was 12, when I came to him out of shame and wanted to confess to watching softcore porn, during which he was extremely understanding and did not attempt to condemn or shame me at all. But the fact that you did keep it a secret indicates that you knew it was wrong. And I never told him about your tests because, first of all, I assumed that you were right to do them because you were my parent. Secondly, I was deeply ashamed, and the last thing a young girl wants to do is to be interrogated by her father about masturbation, which is a far more humiliating prospect. It was a far more humiliating prospect to me than any of your behavior. Last of all, I didn't actually think that your behavior was wrong in any way. I saw it as similar to you catching me eating too much candy or something like that. At the time, I thought you were just doing your duty as a Christian parent of making sure that your children were not sexually sinning. So it didn't even occur to me to question your behavior or wonder whether it was sexually motivated. To this day, I still don't know what you got out of it. A normal parent would never verbally humiliate their children about innocent self-touching, let alone physically. I realize that now. You weren't even raised fundamentalist or religious or anything, so it wasn't religiously motivated. I've never really figured this one out. Did you get off on it? Was it a humiliation fetish? As far as childhood goes, this series of events obviously sticks out. The only other weird thing I remember was your habit of kissing my brother's penises and testicles while you were changing their diapers. Never Maggie's genitals. Again, at the time, I didn't think anything of it, just assumed it was motherly love, the same thing as when you feel the urge to bite a baby's foot or arm or something just because it's so cute. I've heard people call it cuteness aggression. So you sort of rubbing your face in their genitals and kissing them over and over once they were clean never really stood out to me. I still don't know if that's weird or not, but I do remember it. Nothing much happened between the ages of 10 and 16. You didn't take much interest in me one way or the other, especially not sexually. I went through puberty largely alone, with the occasional bizarre talk from you about the birds and the bees and the reality of sex, which were disturbing and oddly dark. I initially requested help from you, and then once I got the same sort of angry and bizarre treatment, I stopped asking. You were very weird about everything. I feel stupid reading this because you guys already know the story. Whatever, I'll just read it. It's just a paragraph, and then you guys already know this part, but I vaguely remember asking you what a period was after a bunch of older friends had mentioned it at my friend's 13th birthday party, and you became bizarrely angry and told me not to talk about those kinds of things because they were not my concern and that those girls shouldn't have mentioned it in front of me. The day that I actually got my first period, we were at a vacation house in New Hampshire. I was excited and a little freaked out, which was perfectly normal. When I let you know that I had gotten my first period, you left me in my bedroom, fished around in one of your bags in the bathroom, and came back with a pad and a tampon, put them on my bed, and left. I put the pad on and then was confused about what to do with the tampon, never having really inserted anything into that area before. At this point, you apparently became irritated at my bothering of you and threw a tub of Vaseline into the room, sarcastically yelling from behind the door, "Do you want me to do it for you?" Wanting to avoid yet another humiliation ritual, I quickly answered no and proceeded to slather the tampon in Vaseline, and let's just say I went with the pad for the day. This isn't exactly linear, but a few years previous, you had taken the same attitude when I begged you to get me a training bra. My breasts had developed to the point where it was not only awkward, but actually quite painful to walk around without anything supporting them. Once I finally convinced you to go to Target, you proceeded to force me to try on training bras in the public aisles of Target over my clothes because using the dressing room would take too much time, and of course I was already being so selfish as to ask for a special trip to Target to get myself something expensive. I was mortified, pleading with you to stop fastening the bras around me in front of random men and women walking by, and eventually picked one at random just to get out of the store. It hurt me even more than the masturbation humiliation rituals, in a way, just because it was so public and so hurtful to me as an awkward pubescent girl who desperately craved privacy when it came to my body. The lack of sensitivity, looking back on it, the lack of even just raw female understanding, and the hostility towards someone going through a process that you yourself went through and understood is incredible. Once I became much closer friends with Dad around 16 is when things once again got dark. As you yourself described in one of our few live streams together, you became insanely jealous that my dad was getting close to me, as you took that as a rejection. Little did I know that your relationship with him had been falling apart, and in fact had utterly ground to a halt about a year before me and him started talking and hanging out more. So to me, in retrospect, it seems like this explanation of jealousy was more of an explanation of your anger than a real feeling, since you had already given up on your marital relationship. Again, just guessing. Whether you call it jealousy or anger or anything else, this hostility led to you privately hoping I would commit suicide when I moved out, because my dad was spending more time with me at my new apartment. When the outright anger didn't work and only pushed Dad closer to me out of a sense of protection and utter confusion at your hostility, you took a more sinister tack. You began intimating that my father and I had begun engaging in sexual relations, a nasty little trick that you've continued up until this day, despite our continued attestations that this wasn't true. But even worse, you began offering the idea that you could be involved in these relations as some kind of mentally disturbed concept that you could work your way back into a relationship with my dad. I truly believe that at some point between when I was 16 and 18, you saw me and my dad hanging out more, going out to eat, studying at the library, laughing and joking with each other, and lost any and all concept of me as your own daughter. I fully became the other woman. To this day, you will say you have 5 kids, not 6. One day, you locked yourself in a bedroom at Wendell Street telling everyone you were sick and couldn't come out. Later, you revealed to me and Dad that you had actually masturbated the night before to a fantasy of me and my dad having sex, which you felt so guilty and simultaneously angry about that you decided to lock yourself in the room for the following day. It's safe to say at this point I had accepted the reality that you were severely mentally ill, so when you suggested a threesome with you, my dad, and I, and on my 18th birthday, I really didn't take it that seriously. When you suggested that I could just take over your sexual duties with my dad for a little while so you could get your head straight, I also didn't take it that seriously. Who knows whether I had just become desensitized or whether I couldn't handle the active trauma that you were inflicting upon me by breaking these boundaries, and so I just decided to wave it away. The absolute peak of this insanity was sometime when I was 19. You and I were downstairs in the garage of a place Dad and I had moved to give you some space with the kids. You had been going on this long tangent about how miserable you were and how isolated you felt and how you felt bad for being jealous of me and how you could understand why my dad liked me better than you. All of it was abusive, of course, but I felt sympathy for you in a sort of twisted and pathetic way. I offered you a drink, and we both had a couple sips, and then I offered that we could both strip down to our bra and panties. A weird offer in retrospect, but I sort of saw it as an olive branch. Maybe if we could just be with each other, woman to woman, with each other's bodies, you could see that I was not some foreign threat who had stolen your husband, but would recognize my body as the child that you had once loved, held, breastfed, kissed, and hugged. I hadn't done anything wrong, I was just older. And maybe you could see that we weren't really that different after all. We both had women's bodies and insecurities and flaws. I don't know, I was trying to make myself approachable. You agreed, and so there we were in our bras and panties. I tried to joke around about my stomach flab and my badly fitting bra, but there was something undeniably sad about the entire situation. It felt weird. Then you asked me if you could kiss me. Not sure if you were joking. I said yes, and you ever so lightly kissed me on the lips. I felt nauseated, but on the other hand, what's the big deal? We're both women. It's not like you're trying to do anything crazy, right? The next part I have a hard time understanding. I suppose it's maybe my most fundamentally traumatic moment of all. You asked if you could kiss my breasts, and I allowed you to. I don't know why I did. Maybe some sort of sick fascination. Maybe some sort of curiosity about what you wanted to get out of it. I still beat myself up over this to this day. I remember the musty smell and the lighting of that garage so intensely. I pulled down one of my bra straps, exposed my right breast, and you leaned down and sucked on my nipple. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. I was extremely uncomfortable the entire time. I remember looking down your back and seeing your spine sort of sticking up weirdly down your back and feeling utterly repulsed. It wasn't really sexual licking, it was more like suckling like a baby. Your mouth felt cold, which I thought was weird. It was awful. I don't know how you felt about it. Really quickly after you pulled away, we both got dressed, you laughed awkwardly, and you went upstairs to order some takeout food or something with the rest of the kids who had been up there the whole time. We never actually spoke about it ever again. Oddly enough, despite the pattern of sexual humiliation rituals which I had experienced from you throughout my childhood, this experience wasn't humiliating. You didn't seem angry. Which is why the way that I've processed this behavior is through the lens of some kind of mental illness. Maybe you had latent lesbian tendencies that you'd never really dealt with. Maybe your delusion of me being the other woman made you want to see what was so goddamn tempting to my dad. At this point, I knew that Dad had definitively told you to move on, that he believed your marriage was a sham due to your mental issues, and yet you were still hanging around with us, desperately attempting to get back in. It's not really my job to explain it. But despite my consent, I still feel that this was an extremely violative experience that I was manipulated into through you attempting to get my sympathy. You simply crossed a line that no parent should ever cross with their children, and although I was an adult, it was still bad. I may have some sympathy with you due to the fact that no one would do this if they were mentally well, but it doesn't erase the fact that this was obvious parental sexual abuse. Educational. The last section that I want to discuss that has to do directly with my childhood was the educational neglect that my siblings and I suffered at your hands. From the age of about 7 until I enrolled myself in 8th grade, I was routinely pressured by you into falsifying educational records for myself and my 5 siblings to the city of Providence. I don't know if Dad knew what you were doing, because he was at work most of the time and gave our educational care entirely up to you. After setting you up with books and worksheets that he had printed out at his office and put into binders and boxes so you could educate us each according to our grade. My lived experience of your homeschooling was a few months of worksheets and lessons for the first couple school months of each year, maybe September to November, at which point you would inevitably lose focus and stop having lessons regularly each day, opting instead for us to play in our playroom for hours at a time or take us to parks or have us watch a few movies in a row. To be honest, this wasn't the absolute worst way to raise your kids. We got a lot of time in nature, we were forced to come up with new ways to play with our toys, and we didn't watch any cable TV. Nevertheless, even as a child, I simply couldn't understand why you didn't want us to go to school. You were adamant about us staying homeschooled. Apart from the year or two that we went to ballet class and made friends there, we really didn't interact with any other kids. It was extremely isolated, and, as I mentioned before, there were often violent episodes, particularly against John, due to your frustration at teaching young kids. There's nothing wrong with not wanting to homeschool, but your refusal to enroll us in normal public school was really frustrating to me for a long time. The actual... Lala, listen up. You lost to her by 12 points on the IQ test. She literally had no education. The actual non-schooling wasn't so bad. It was around May of each year when things would get crazy. You would start freaking out about presenting records to the city to prove you had educated your kids, which you obviously hadn't. I, as your eldest daughter, was made responsible for faking these records, with the implicit threat of mommy going to jail if I didn't do a good job. That level of responsibility was so abusive to put on me at such a young age that it viscerally offends me to this day. I mean, I was terrified that you would go to jail. I would spend weeks preparing these records, and I still have our last few fake homeschooling records in my Google archive. At this point, we had a laptop, so I would comb through actual homeschooling curriculums online and select books or programs that it would seem believable that you had taught. All the while thinking, wait, why couldn't we just have actually been taught this? That would have been fun. I would have to sit through pages of your attendance record templates that you had printed out and switch between blue, black, and red pens to put check marks or X's for every date for every child to make it seem believable. That's 1,080 check marks for 6 kids each year. Then came the actual worksheets. I would actually sit there on the same granite countertops that I mentioned earlier and fill out worksheets that Charlie or Tommy or Maggie were supposed to have done with my left hand to imitate childish writing. I would create elaborate graphs tracking our progress, 6 pages each for 6 subjects that 6 kids were supposedly taught. 216 pages of fake information every year with the threat of my mom going to jail if I didn't make it believable. The stress was unreal. It was unbelievable and contributed heavily to my issues with OCD. There were 2 cherries atop this train wreck. First, when the day came to actually submit the fake records, you would drive us all over to some government building next to a school. You would hand me the folders full of lies and point to the building and make me take them in and hand them to the nice old black lady at the front desk, because you said they were less likely to be suspicious if a kid handed them in. Secondly, after all this hard work, you would always promise me that I would get a reward, sushi or a new book, and yet without fail, every year you would simply get too busy with the kids, or we didn't have enough money or some other issue, and I wouldn't actually get my reward. Sad, isn't it? And if I asked you about the reward, I would get yelled at for being selfish. To sum up this section, I guess I would say that although me and my siblings were woefully undereducated for close to 7 years of our lives, and mind you, this continued for the rest of my siblings after I enrolled myself in 8th grade until I took action and enrolled the rest of them in school once we moved to Warwick, that isn't even my biggest problem with your behavior. Although, thinking back on it, it is actually extraordinarily selfish that you deprived 6 children of a full education because you wanted to maintain your delusion that you were a traditional homeschooling mom. And just goes to show how little you ever cared for any of us or our futures, despite the fact that you yourself had been raised in an upper middle class family, graduated high school, and went to 4 years of college that was paid for in large part by your dad. But putting that aside, the worst of it was the inexcusable manipulation and threats of potential jail time for mommy that really put the nail in the coffin. And that was done to me solely as the eldest daughter who was responsible for helping you out of the sticky situations you had gotten yourself into year after year after year. The amount of responsibility that you put on my shoulders is truly beyond imagination, especially due to the fact that it was all so avoidable. Mental breakdown / stonewalling. We're almost done, okay? After all this, and likely due to your guilt about having done all of this, your last and final abuse of me, at least of me, although it is ongoing with my siblings, was your supposed mental breakdown from 2018 to 2023, and your emotional stonewalling. It's an understandable, though awful, response. As I became an older teen, I started asking questions about what you had put me through, emboldened by my dad, who was unaware of this history and felt terrible for being so oblivious. He, in fact, had been lied to. You had apparently told him that I was an entitled brat and that it was best that you just both let me go to school and move on with my life. He only came to realize that he was actually enabling your abuse after finding some text between me and a friend who was going through a breakup, which made him realize that I was actually a very caring and loving person and that my character had been misrepresented to him by you. Once you were confronted by me and him in our own ways, both separately and together, you conveniently slipped into what could only be called a mental collapse, the very same thing your mother had done when you were a teenager and which you had condemned. This resulted in various obscenities, the least of which would be things like you urinating all over yourself while playing ball games with us at the park. A forgivable mistake at the time, but in retrospect, an avoidable humiliation of your children, which was done intentionally, I believe, to communicate that mommy isn't doing so well. It amped up over time. After my brother John had knee surgery, you stole a few pills of his pain medication and took the pills on a Discord call with some trolls you had become friends with, which I was only made aware of through one of these trolls actually calling me and informing me because he felt genuinely somewhat disturbed and cared about me. Then there were the periods of abandonment. When we moved out of Wendell Street and into Warwick, you stayed behind at One Solar, apparently watching a lot of YouTube videos about how to patch drywall while smoking cigarettes and drinking. A lot. After the house at Warwick fell apart due to my utter refusal to play mommy while you took a vacation, Dad asked you to move back in with us, to which you responded, "Why?" He asked you if you missed your kids, and you shrugged it off. When you eventually moved in, and Dad and I went over to Solar Street to figure out what the hell you had been up to over there, we found a large pile of empty liquor bottles, ashtrays, and bizarrely, a very large pile of feces in your old marital bed. Literally just a pile of shit that would either have to have been left by a very large animal, like a horse or a deer, or you. There was never any explanation for this. Warwick eventually became the same shithole that One Solar Street had been, thanks to your loving care, and my dad and I moved back in to try to work things out. You had been drinking more and more, and it didn't seem altogether safe to leave you with the kids, considering that they had started to wake up for school and find you passed out on the living room floor, face down and ass up. As far as I remember, we were there for about a month, during which my dad suggested separating once more in the hopes that we could find a situation that would benefit everyone maximally and de-escalate the tension. I just want to include in here that there was like back and forth, like more than I'm saying right here, but I did skip over some details in various ways at different times in this whole letter. And it's kind of a rough draft in a way. So anyways. Filled with fury at this suggestion, you decided to leave in the dead of night, walking out of the house without any explanation. I tried to call and text you, and there was no answer. This runaway game carried on for several months, and I became severely depressed, as I once again felt like I was being forced to play mom in the house. And you had done this to me so much at this point that I was utterly hopeless that you would ever take responsibility for your own children. At some point in all this, you attempted to have a heartfelt conversation with my siblings about how you didn't actually want to be their mother anymore, which left Joey and Maggie in tears, sobbing in my arms after you left. Later, I would find out that you had walked over to Grandpa Eric's house, lied to him that my dad had kicked you out with no clothes or money, convinced him to get you a hotel room in secret, and then told us in our very brief communications with you that you were living in a car. It's hard to convey exactly how brutal this was to live through. Once again, I had been burdened with the responsibility of my 4, at the time, minor siblings. Of course, my dad had also been screwed by you taking off, and he tried his best to minimize the damage by just having us order takeout food and getting the guys off to school, so the gaping hole of mom wasn't as noticeable. All while dealing with my genuine collapse and rage at this latest betrayal. But I had no idea when it would end. My life was on hold once again for you. It's not physical abuse, it's not sexual abuse. It's something deeper, and something that genuinely inspired suicidal ideation in me. The idea that I was beholden to this monster, and the fact that you could hurt my dad and my siblings, would keep me in this loop eternally because I couldn't bear to leave them behind. I simply couldn't bear the idea of leaving my young siblings without a mother or an older sister. I knew that my dad loved them, and that he would take care of them if I left, but they simply wouldn't get the motherly love or tenderness that, despite my depression, I felt I was able to offer them here and there. They were my babies, in a way. I had been so parentified at that point that it felt excruciating to imagine Joey being sick or something like that and having no mom there to take care of him. And so I hated you for this. I hated you with everything in me. My rage had never been so fully realized towards you until this point. I didn't care if you were homeless or living it up. I didn't care about you, and that's what you didn't seem to realize. It still fills me with rage to this day to think about what you put me through for those months that you ran away. The fact that you were weaponizing the fact that you had parentified me to do it again, knowing that I wouldn't leave, and therefore your kids would have a mom because you had made me into one. To this day, I hate you the most of all for this. You didn't even explain what you were doing, and no matter how much I begged you to come back or talk or explain, you never fucking responded. The stonewalling was just an addendum to this. First you were crazy, then you were gone, then you were cold. You lied to Dad and I about wanting to come back to be with the kids and asked us to leave once again so we could all avoid the tension. When you got back from your runaway trip, after settling in for a week or two, you filed a restraining order against Dad so that he couldn't talk to or see you or the kids that he had been taking care of for the past 4 months. On top of that, even though the restraining order did not technically apply to me, you didn't allow my siblings to see me either. You didn't let my sister Maggie visit me on my birthday to go bowling. You called the cops on me when I tried to take my brother Joey out from McDonald's. You utterly alienated me, the girl who had raised those kids, the parentified eldest daughter, after using me for so many years. And those relationships are mostly dead now, thanks to you. They don't see me that way anymore. They no longer trust me. Because mommy started to act like I was bad and dangerous to them. We're no longer close. Eventually, I couldn't bring myself to text them anymore. I'm not guilty, guys. I didn't do anything wrong. I love you all so much. What Mom did was wrong. They were too confused or young to know any better. After sitting through your emotional breakdown, your abuse, your obscenities, you pulled the last card. You played the victim of both me and Dad to his kids, my siblings, and drove the last and final knife into my heart. Told Maggie that my dad had raped me. Told Joey that his sister was a weirdo. John even went on YouTube to tell people that I suck my dad's dick all the time, despite not having seen me for a couple years at that point either. The betrayal was final. And no matter how much I texted you, how much I tried to process this online, or with Dad, or with myself, or called you, or showed up at your house, you were nothing but cold. No response, no answers. Conclusion. And that's continued to this day. I think it's been about 9 months or so since I got a text back from you. Boy, did I ever feel like an idiot sending you all those texts, especially when someone told me that instead of responding to me, you were actually sharing those texts with people on Discord in private messaging groups and making fun of me. I gotta say, it was a smart move. Seems sympathetic, confused, crazy even, and then one day just cut off. I was reeling for months, Mom, publicly and privately. It was a mental hell. Oh, and then the court proceedings, of course. Divorce! Going to court for 26 solid months to watch you utterly betray everything you had said you cared about. Your marriage, your children, your family, staying loyal, never divorcing. To watch you profane the promises you had made to all of us in front of fat women in black robes. You knew they didn't actually care, but I'm sure it was fun. To watch Dad and I, bedraggled, living in an RV, desperately trying to make ends meet, haul ourselves into court just to be humiliated by your slew of accusations against us. This is the last paragraph. There's only one thing for me to solve. The fact that I can't really work with Dad and get our career going because of my unresolved trauma with you, and the unbelievably brutal campaign of slander that you, John, and your troll friends have launched against me for the past 2 years or so. And I know how to resolve that trauma now. I sort of just did it right here. All the endless self-questioning, all the sleepless nights, the anxiety, the poverty, the public confusion, the self-soothing, it's all going to be over soon. Whether it's exactly as I've written it here or not, I've written it. This is my story. It's very dramatic, I know, but whatever. Grace. Obviously, ChatGPT. Nope, no part of this was written by ChatGPT. Okay. Where are the tears? Where are the tears?
Grace.
Okay, I did it. See, they're all making fun of me. They're making fun of me. See, I told you. Cannot trust them.
Go have a smoky.
Thank you. Damius gifted 5 subs.
Yes, Damius.
All right, I'll let you guys process that together. And look, I'll admit, thank you, Damian. I'll admit it was a little dramatic, okay? I wrote it, I was crying. It's hard to read with the exact same passion that I wrote it in.
Get the fuck out of here,
okay,
Grace.
all right.
It's totally fine. Thank you, Gaiman. Okay, well done, Grace. I'm proud of you. Exactly, yes.